The night is thick with the scent of burning herbs, the air humming with low chants as robed figures move in a slow, deliberate circle around a towering oak. Flames flicker, casting long shadows that seem to twist and dance with a life of their own. This isn't just a gathering, it's a gateway to the unseen, a moment where the veil between worlds grows thin. Welcome to the world of the Druids, history's most mysterious guardians of ancient wisdom. For centuries, their secrets have been whispered in fragments, their true story buried beneath layers of myth and misconception. But what if we could pull back that veil? What if the truth about their rituals, their power, and their enduring influence is far stranger and far more fascinating than we've been led to believe? Picture this, a society so revered that kings sought their counsel, so feared that invading armies hesitated to cross them. The Druids weren't just priests or healers, they were the living memory of their people, the keepers of knowledge so sacred it was never written down. Their teachings were passed mouth to ear, a secret thread connecting generations. But here's the twist, almost everything we think we know about them comes from the accounts of their enemies. Roman historians painted them as savage sorcerers, while medieval scribes blurred their legacy with fantasy. So who were they really? What hidden truths lie behind the legends of stone circles and sacred groves? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. From the depths of forgotten forests to the echoes of their rituals in modern traditions, we're piecing together the puzzle of the Druids' true legacy. You'll discover how their understanding of the natural world bordered on the supernatural, why their disappearance might not be as complete as history claims, and how their influence still lingers in ways you'd never expect. This isn't just a story about the past, it's about the echoes of a wisdom so profound it refuses to fade. So take a step closer to the firelight. The secrets of the Druids are waiting. The first whispers of the Druids reach us through the ink-stained pages of Roman conquerors and Greek travelers, men who watched them from the outside, half in awe, half in fear. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars gives us one of the clearest glimpses, describing them as philosophers, judges, and spiritual leaders who held more power than kings. But here's the catch: Caesar had every reason to exaggerate. Painting the Druids as fearsome mystics justified his brutal campaigns to crush Celtic resistance. So how much of his account can we trust? Dig deeper, and you'll find earlier traces. Greek historian Posidonius wrote of Druids debating the stars and the nature of the soul, while later Roman writers like Pliny the Elder fixated on their eerie rituals, white-robed figures cutting mistletoe with golden sickles or chanting over cauldrons of prophecy. But these scattered fragments raise more questions than answers. If the Druids left no written records of their own, how far back do their roots truly stretch? Some scholars trace their lineage to the Neolithic builders of Stonehenge and Newgrange, suggesting their knowledge of astronomy and earth energies might have been passed down through millennia. Others see echoes of older Indo-European traditions, connections to the Brahmin priests of India or the seers of ancient Persia. The truth, the Druids weren't a sudden phenomenon. They were likely the culmination of centuries, even millennia, of oral tradition, a living bridge between the megalithic past and the Iron Age world. But perhaps the most tantalizing clue lies in their name itself. The word Druid might derive from the Celtic Druid, meaning oak knower, a hint that their wisdom was inextricably tied to the sacred groves where they taught. And that's the heart of the mystery. Their power didn't come from scrolls or temples, but from the land itself. The Romans couldn't burn that knowledge away. They could only drive it deeper into the shadows. To understand the Druids, you have to see them not as lone mystics, but as part of a living, breathing intellectual network, one woven into the very fabric of Celtic life. Their society recognized three sacred paths, each vital to maintaining balance between the human and the divine: the Druids, the Bards, and the Ovates. Think of it as an ancient trinity of wisdom where knowledge wasn't just stored, it was performed, sung, and divined into existence. At the pinnacle stood the Druids themselves, the philosophers, judges, and high priests. They were the lawmakers, the arbiters of disputes, and the keepers of celestial knowledge. Irish Brehon texts describe how their rulings could halt battles before they began, their authority so absolute that even kings bowed to their interpretations of natural and divine law. A Druid's training could take 20 years, memorizing countless verses on everything from medicinal herbs to the movements of the stars. But here's what's fascinating: they weren't just scholars. They were diplomats. When tribes clashed, Druids negotiated peace under the sacred oaks, their words carrying the weight of tradition and the gods themselves. Then came the Bards, the living libraries of their people. Cloaked in the power of poetry, they didn't just recite history, they shaped it. A well-versed bard could elevate a warrior to legend with a single epic or destroy a chieftain's reputation with a satirical verse. Their training was grueling, demanding perfect recall of hundreds of tales, genealogies, and praise poems. But their role went beyond entertainment. In a culture without written records, the bard was the glue between generations, ensuring lineage, treaties, and even land boundaries were preserved in rhythm and rhyme. Lose a bard, and you didn't just lose a performer, you risked losing the memory of your ancestors. Finally, the Ovates, the seers and healers who walked the knife's edge between worlds. While Druids studied the cosmos and bards preserved the past, Ovates spoke to the future. They read omens in the flight of birds, interpreted dreams, and knew which herbs could mend a wound or open the mind to visions. Some scholars believe they were the inheritors of even older shamanic traditions, their practices echoing back to the megalithic builders who aligned stones with the solstices. In times of crisis, communities turned to them for guidance, trusting their ability to decipher the whispers of the unseen. What's striking is how fluid these roles could be. A Druid might weave prophecy, a bard might study law, and an Ovate could compose poetry because wisdom, to the Celts, wasn't meant to be boxed in. It was a living current flowing between disciplines. When Rome crushed the Druidic strongholds in Britain and Gaul, they didn't just disband a priesthood. They shattered a system where knowledge was song, law was living memory, and the future was a conversation with the wind. Imagine spending 2 decades of your life learning in silence, forbidden to write down a single word. Every law, every healing herb, every star's path etched into memory through relentless repetition. This was the price of becoming a Druid. Their education wasn't just rigorous, it was a metamorphosis, stripping away the ordinary to forge a mind that could hold the weight of an entire culture's wisdom. The process began young. Medieval Irish texts like the Boyhood Deeds of Fionn describe initiates as young as 7 taken into the care of seasoned Druids, often in remote forest sanctuaries or caverns where the outside world couldn't intrude. Picture a child kneeling by a fire, reciting verses until dawn, their voice growing hoarse as they internalized the cadence of sacred knowledge. Mistakes weren't just corrected. They were seen as ruptures in the fabric of tradition, dangerous gaps where history could leak away. But memorization was only the foundation. The real test came in the interpretation. A Druid didn't just recite laws, they embodied them, learning to adapt ancient principles to new conflicts, much like a judge today might reference centuries-old legal precedents. Tales speak of students debating under oak trees, their teachers pressing them to reconcile contradictions in the law or unravel the hidden meanings behind prophecies. And then there were the Imbaz Forestni, the mystical techniques said to ignite sudden enlightenment rituals where aspirants chewed on raw flesh, meditated in complete darkness, or fasted until visions erupted from the emptiness. The most striking accounts come from caves. In Irish myth, heroes like Fionn mac Cumhaill gain wisdom by touching the salmon of knowledge or lying in tombs to commune with spirits. These stories might echo real initiation rites ordeals where novices spent nights in pitch-black caverns. their senses starved until the boundaries between thought and vision blurred. Surviving such trials proved more than endurance. It signaled a mind capable of straddling the seen and unseen worlds. Yet the ultimate lesson wasn't just knowledge, it was responsibility. A fully trained Druid emerged not as a solitary sage, but as a living conduit for their people's survival. Their memory held treaties that kept tribes from war, verses that could heal plagues, and star maps that dictated when to plant and harvest. When Rome sought to erase them, they didn't just target priests, they attacked the very idea that wisdom could live, breathless and unbroken, in the human voice. But as we'll see, some threads of that knowledge were never truly cut. Among the towering oaks of ancient Gaul and Britain, where sunlight filtered through leaves like sacred script upon the earth, the Druids found their sanctuaries. These weren't just clusters of trees, they were living cathedrals, places where the boundary between earth and sky, human and divine, dissolved into whispers. Pliny the Elder left us one of the most haunting snapshots. Druids clad in white, their golden sickles glinting as they harvested mistletoe from the highest branches, careful never to let the plant touch the ground. Why mistletoe? To the Celts, it was more than a parasitic vine. It was a symbol of the gods' laughter, a plant that grew between heaven and earth without roots, dripping with berries like droplets of celestial knowledge. But the groves held deeper secrets. Anglesey, an island off the coast of Wales, was called Mon Mam Cymru, Mother of Wales, by the Celts, a place so holy that Roman historians claimed it was the Druids' last stronghold. When Roman troops finally invaded, they described priestesses shrieking curses, their hair wild as storm clouds, and fires that burned with unnatural colors. The forest of the Ardennes, stretching across modern-day Belgium and France, was another nexus. Here, springs bubbled with water said to hold visions, and the very trees were believed to murmur prophecies to those who listened. Rituals here weren't scripted ceremonies, they were conversations with the land. A Druid might press their ear to the bark of an ancient oak, interpreting its creaks as messages from the other world. Springs were not just sources of water, but portals, places where offerings of carved wooden figures or precious metals were submerged, gifts to spirits that blurred the line between deity and landscape. Even the wind carried meaning. The rustling of leaves in a sacred grove wasn't random noise but a language, one the Druids claimed to understand. This reverence wasn't passive. It was reciprocal. The land gave wisdom, and the Druids gave back through seasonal rites aligning with solstices, through careful management of forests to ensure balance, through songs sung to the soil to guarantee fertility. When the Romans cut down the groves, they weren't just destroying temples, they were severing a dialogue that had thrived for millennia, yet traces linger. In Ireland, lone hawthorns still stand in fields, untouched by farmers who call them fairy trees. In Brittany, wells are adorned with ribbons tied by modern seekers hoping for healing. The Druids may have vanished, but the land remembers. Buried for centuries in the French soil near Lyon, a fragmented bronze tablet emerged in 1897, its surface etched with cryptic markings that would rewrite our understanding of Druidic timekeeping. The Coligny calendar, as it came to be known, isn't just a relic, it's a celestial cipher, a 5-foot-long bronze puzzle piecing together a lunar solar system so precise it rivals the calendars of Rome. Imagine a society without telescopes, yet tracking the moon's phases with such accuracy that their calendar could correct its own errors, slipping in extra months to keep lunar and solar cycles in harmony. This wasn't just a tool for planting crops, it was a testament to the Druids' mastery of the cosmos, woven into the very metal they shaped. The calendar's design is mesmerizing. Divided into 16 columns, each representing a 62-month cycle, it marks time in 2 distinct phases, mottos for lucky, bright months and mottos for unlucky, dark ones. But the real magic lies in its intercalary months, extra periods inserted every 2.5 years to sync with the sun. Without these adjustments, seasons would drift, festivals would fall out of alignment, and the sacred rhythm of the year would falter. The Druids didn't just observe time, they danced with it, bending lunar math to serve the sun's journey. And then there are the festivals. Scattered across the calendar's grid, names leap out like echoes from the past. Samhain, marked at the threshold between October and November when the veil between worlds was said to fray. This wasn't just a date, it was a doorway. Cattle were driven from summer pastures, bonfires blazed to ward off spirits, and the Druids likely gathered to read omens in the smoke. Beltane, halfway through the calendar, heralded summer's arrival with rites of fertility and fire. Even the Roman historian Pliny, who scorned Druidic practices, grudgingly noted their uncanny ability to predict eclipses, a skill perhaps honed by tracking these very cycles. What's startling is how the calendar defies stereotypes. The Druids weren't wild-eyed mystics howling at the moon. They were meticulous timekeepers, their rituals rooted in celestial mechanics. The Coligny fragments even include corrections, scratched out errors where a scribe adjusted a month's length, proof that this was a living document refined over generations. Some scholars argue it wasn't just a religious tool but a political one, unifying tribes under shared holy days, turning time itself into a binding force. Yet the calendar's deepest secret might be its survival. When Rome sought to dismantle Druidic power, they banned their rituals and felled their groves, but time, etched in bronze, proved harder to erase. Hidden away, perhaps by a last guardian of the old ways, the Coligny calendar waited centuries to whisper its truth, that the Druids didn't just fear the passage of time. They spoke its language. The Romans left us chilling accounts of towering wicker figures engulfed in flame, their hollow frames packed with living prisoners, a spectacle so horrifying it became the stuff of imperial propaganda. Julius Caesar described these sacrifices as central to Druidic practice, claiming the Celts believed the gods favored those who paid the ultimate price. But here's the problem. Nearly all we know comes from the conquerors' pens, written to justify their own brutality. Modern archaeology paints a far murkier picture, one where the line between ritual and retribution blurs in the peat bogs of Europe. Take Lindoman, the 2,000-year-old body pulled from an English bog in 1984. His stomach held traces of mistletoe pollen, hinting at a final sacred meal. His skull was fractured, his throat slit, his body placed carefully in the water, a sequence suggesting meticulous ceremony, not random violence. Some scholars argue he was a willing sacrifice, chosen to mediate between worlds during a time of crisis. Others point to his manicured fingernails and lack of manual labor marks, suggesting nobility executed for treason. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a ritualized killing where the sacred and the political intertwined. Bog bodies across northern Europe tell similar stories. The Id girl in the Netherlands, her hair preserved in a long, eerie braid. Old Croghan man in Ireland, his nipples sliced, a detail that mirrors ancient Irish kingship rituals where nipple sucking symbolized submission to a ruler. These deaths weren't casual brutality. They followed patterns, precise injuries mirroring Celtic myths of triple deaths by wounding, drowning, and strangulation. Even the bogs themselves held meaning. These waterlogged liminal spaces were seen as gateways to the otherworld, places where offerings could cross between realms. The Wicker Man presents another puzzle. No archaeological evidence of these structures exists, and Roman descriptions suspiciously mirror their own executions of rebels in cages. Could the Wicker Man be a projection of Rome's fears, or perhaps a rare, extreme measure reserved for times of plague or invasion? Irish texts describe burning in the House of Wood as a punishment for kings who broke sacred oaths, suggesting a grim intersection of law and ritual. What emerges isn't a clear verdict, but a spectrum. The Druids likely practiced some form of human sacrifice, but not as Rome's caricature of bloodthirsty fanatics. These were calculated, solemn acts reserved for moments when the very balance of the world seemed at stake. a bad harvest, a looming invasion, a king's hubris triggering divine wrath. In such crises, the offering of a life might have been seen as the only way to restore harmony. The bodies in the bogs aren't just victims, they're messages frozen in time, begging us to see beyond Roman spin to a culture where death wasn't an end, but a conversation with forces we've long forgotten how to hear. Long before written laws dictated justice, the Druids wielded a power far subtler than swords, the power of words spoken under sacred oaks. In Celtic society, a dispute between chieftains wasn't settled on the battlefield but in the presence of a Druid whose verdict carried the weight of divine law. The Ulster cycle, Ireland's ancient epic tapestry, reveals how deeply intertwined their role was with the fabric of daily life. Take the saga of Fergus mac Roach, a warrior king who lost his throne after breaking his jays, a sacred taboo forbidding him from refusing a feast. It wasn't armies that toppled him, but the unraveling of a cosmic order the Druids were sworn to uphold. These Jesa plural of jays weren't arbitrary rules. They were intricate bonds tying a person's fate to the natural and supernatural worlds. Some were protective, like Cu Chulain's prohibition against eating dog meat, a taboo honoring his namesake, the hound he slew as a boy. Others were political, ensuring kings didn't overreach. Break a jays, and the consequences weren't just social disgrace, they were cosmic. When Queen Medb of Connacht ignored her jays to never let a man surpass her in wealth, her obsession with stealing Ulster's prized bull triggered a war that left thousands dead. The Druids didn't merely enforce these taboos, they interpreted their layers, discerning whether a violation was accidental or a deliberate flouting of balance. Their courtroom was the land itself. Disputes over cattle raids or boundaries were settled at Onak gatherings, open-air assemblies where Druids presided like living law libraries. The surviving Brehon laws, though recorded later, hint at their methods. Compensation for murder wasn't dictated by vengeance but by the victim's worth to the tribe, a ladder of values where a poet's life might equal 3 kings. Oaths weren't sworn on parchment but over relics like the Lia Fail, the screaming stone of Tara said to roar when touched by a true ruler. A false oath didn't just risk earthly punishment, it invited supernatural retribution, a curse woven into the very words. Perhaps the most striking example lies in the Tain Bo Cuilnge, where Druid judges halt a battle between Connacht and Ulster by declaring a temporary truce not out of mercy, but because the stars weren't aligned for combat. Their authority didn't come from coercion but from collective belief in their connection to forces beyond human whims. When Rome dismantled the Druidic schools, they didn't just erase priests, they severed a justice system where law was alive, breathing, and rooted in the land's whispers. Yet echoes remain. In remote Irish villages, some still avoid cutting down lone hawthorns, their roots tangled with the old Jesa that once bound kings and commoners alike to something greater than themselves. In the flickering torchlight of a chieftain's hall, a lone figure stands, his voice weaving not just words but the very memory of a people. This wasn't mere storytelling, it was an act of preservation so precise that a single syllable out of place could unravel generations of knowledge. The Druids' refusal to commit sacred law to writing wasn't superstition. It was a deliberate act of safeguarding. Writing, they believed, made knowledge static, vulnerable to misinterpretation or theft. But spoken verse, locked into the rigid cadence of Don Dyrach, their strict poetic meter became a living vault, impervious to corruption. The rules of Don Dyrach were unforgiving. Each line had to obey complex patterns of alliteration, rhyme, and syllable count, with penalties for even the slightest deviation. A bard might spend years mastering the 7 grades of poetry, from simple praise songs to the esoteric troskad, a fasting chant so potent it could allegedly compel the gods. The payoff, a single recitation could preserve a king's genealogy, a battle's outcome, or the boundaries of tribal lands with near scientific accuracy. Irish annals recount bards reciting ancestral lines spanning 600 years without error, a feat modern historians verify against archaeological records. But why this obsession with orality? The answer lies in the Celtic view of sound as sacred vibration. Words weren't just symbols, they carried baz, a mystical force that could alter reality. Writing trapped that power on dead parchment, while spoken verse kept it alive in the breath between teacher and student. This wasn't unique to the Celts. Vedic hymns in India followed similar oral traditions, but the Druids took it further, embedding checksums into their poetry. A single misplaced alliteration would alert listeners to tampering, making their verses self-correcting archives. The arrival of Christianity in the 5th century forced a compromise. Monks began transcribing bardic tales, but even they preserved the old meters, often inserting notes like, as the poets say, to acknowledge their sources. The Liber Gabala Iren, or Book of Invasions, is a patchwork of these oral accounts, its verses still echoing the Don Diarach cadences, yet something vital was lost in transcription. A written saga couldn't adapt to new audiences or contexts, freezing what was once fluid. The bard's greatest trick was making memory communal. A single recitation could shift emphasis to suit the times, ensuring relevance across centuries. That adaptive genius, more than any parchment, kept the Druids' voice alive in the whispers of hazel groves long after Rome fell. In the quiet corners of ancient forests, where sunlight dappled through oak leaves onto moss-covered stones, the Druids practiced a form of medicine that blurred the line between science and sacrament. Their knowledge of herbs wasn't just practical, it was poetic, rooted in the doctrine of signatures, the belief that a plant's appearance hinted at its purpose. Take vervain, its slender stalks crowned with tiny purple flowers like a crown of veins. To the Druids, this wasn't coincidence, it was a sign. They brewed it into teas to strengthen the blood, believing its very form whispered its use. Yarrow, with its feathery leaves and stubborn resilience, became a battlefield staple, pressed into wounds to staunch bleeding while chanting incantations to seal flesh and fate together. But their herbalism went deeper than folklore. Archaeological digs across Europe revealed traces of their pharmacopoeia, pollen from chamomile and poppy in ritual cups, suggesting sedatives for surgery or spiritual journeys. The Lindo man, the bog body found with mistletoe in his stomach, may have consumed it not as a poison but as a purgative, a last rite to cleanse his soul before crossing over. The Celts even classified plants into sacred tiers, luib for everyday herbs, fogma for those with potent properties, and neum, the holiest of all, like mistletoe, which could only be cut with golden sickles during specific moon phases. What's fascinating is how these practices echo across time. Medieval herbals like the Leech Book of Bald copied Celtic charms verbatim, swapping Druidic gods for Christian saints. A 9th century cure for headaches called for feverfew, wrapped in red cloth while reciting a spell, a near-identical ritual to older Celtic versions. Even the doctrine of signatures resurfaced in Renaissance Europe, with physicians using walnut shells resembling brains to treat mental ailments. The Druids didn't just pass down recipes, they embedded a worldview where every leaf and root was a thread in the web of life, vibrating with meaning. Yet their greatest legacy might be in the margins. Irish monks scribbled herbal notes beside biblical texts, preserving Druidic knowledge under the guise of piety. A cure for joint pain involving willow bark, a natural source of salicin, the precursor to aspirin, appears in both Ogham carvings and medieval manuscripts. The lines between magic and medicine dissolve when you realize their glam dissonant healing incantations often coincided with precise herbal doses, leveraging placebo and chemistry in one breath. Modern science now confirms what the Druids intuited: yarrow's anti-inflammatory properties, vervain's calming effects. Their wisdom wasn't lost, it was distilled, waiting for us to listen. The towering stones of Stonehenge loom against the English sky, their weathered faces whispering secrets older than the Druids themselves. Here's the surprise: those iconic monoliths were already ancient by the time the first Druids walked the earth. Carbon dating places Stonehenge's earliest phases around 3000 BCE, over 2000 years before Celtic culture emerged. So if the Druids didn't build these monuments, why do we so often picture them chanting among the Sarsens? The answer lies in a collision of history and imagination, where later generations looked upon these enigmatic structures and saw the hand of their most revered sages. Archaeology paints a clearer picture. The megalithic builders belonged to Neolithic farmers, ancestors of the Celts, who aligned their stones with celestial precision. Stonehenge's heel stone marks the summer solstice sunrise, while Newgrange's passage tomb in Ireland floods with light on the winter solstice, proof of sophisticated astronomical knowledge. But when Celtic culture arose in the Iron Age, these sites took on new meaning. The Druids, inheritors of an oral tradition stretching back millennia, likely recognized these places as nexuses of power. Imagine them gathering at the Callanish stones in Scotland, not to erect them but to channel their energy, layering their own rituals atop the old stones like pages in a palimpsest. This reinterpretation birthed enduring myths, ley lines. Those hypothetical energy pathways connecting ancient sites were popularized in the 20th century, yet they echo older beliefs. Medieval Welsh texts speak of Elelwybrau dw circumflexar, water paths, invisible currents the Druids allegedly navigated. While modern science dismisses ley lines as fantasy, the idea persists because it taps into something primal, the human instinct to find patterns in the landscape, to see the earth as alive and threaded with meaning. The solstice celebrations we associate with Druids, those are layers of reinvention. Roman accounts mention Celtic fire festivals like Beltane, but linking them to megalithic alignments is largely a Romantic-era invention. 18th century antiquarians, dazzled by Stonehenge's geometry, grafted Druidic lore onto the stones, creating a hybrid history that still captivates us today. Yet the truth is no less fascinating. The Druids may not have built these monuments, but they became their custodians, bridging the gap between the builders' forgotten purpose and the living traditions of the Iron Age. Those stones, silent for centuries, found new voices in the chants of the oak knowers. What lingers is the resonance. When modern visitors flock to Stonehenge at dawn on the solstice, they're part of an unbroken human impulse to stand between earth and sky, to mark time's turning, to seek connection across the ages. The Druids understood that power. They may not have raised the megaliths, but they taught us how to listen to them. When we think of Druids, the image that often comes to mind is a bearded sage in white robes, his hands raised to the sky. But history whispers a different truth, one where women stood just as tall among the oaks, their voices shaping fate as surely as any man's. Take Fedelm, the prophetess from the Táin Bó Cúailnge, who met Queen Madibi on the eve of war. Cloaked in mystery and carrying a silver branch, she didn't just predict the coming bloodshed. She foretold it in verse so potent that Madibi, the fiercest ruler in Irish myth, hesitated. Fedelm wasn't an exception. She was part of a tradition where women wielded the same sacred authority as their male counterparts, their insight revered as a bridge between worlds. The Romans left clues too. Strabo wrote of an island off the coast of Gaul, likely the Isle of Seine in Brittany, where a sisterhood of 9 priestesses guarded a sacred grove. These women were said to command the winds, summon storms, and shapeshift into animals. While Roman accounts drip with exoticism, they concede one startling fact. No one, not even a seasoned warrior, dared set foot on that island without the priestess's permission. These weren't passive acolytes, they were gatekeepers of a power so formidable it gave pause to an empire. Then there's Boudica, the warrior queen who led a rebellion against Rome. Though not a Druid herself, she rallied the Iceni with the blessing of Druidic priestesses, their chants fueling her army's fury. Tacitus describes how they interpreted omens before battle, their hair loose and wild as they invoked the gods of vengeance. Their presence wasn't ceremonial. It was strategic proof that Druidic women weren't confined to quiet groves but stood at the heart of political and military upheaval. The Irish banfalid or female poets carried this legacy forward. Women like Liadane, whose laments could move armies to tears, or Scathach, the warrior instructor who trained heroes from the Isle of Skye, blurred the lines between seer, scholar, and strategist. Even in later Welsh lore, figures like Cerred, one keeper of the cauldron of inspiration, embody the old archetype of the Druidess as both nurturer and wielder of terrifying wisdom. What's striking is how these roles defied simplistic categories. A Druidess might be a healer one moment, a political advisor the next, and a wartime prophetess when the need arose. The Romans, with their rigid gender roles, struggled to reconcile this. Their accounts oscillate between awe and dismissal, painting these women as both fearsome sorceresses and hysterical fanatics. But the fragments that survive tell a different story, one where power wasn't gendered, but earned through knowledge, ritual purity, and the ability to walk between worlds. The echoes linger in unexpected places. In Scottish folklore, the Bean Nye, a washerwoman at the ford foretells death, her role mirroring the prophetic druidesses of old. In Ireland, holy wells once tended by pagan priestesses became sites of pilgrimage for Christian nuns, the water's power never forgotten, only renamed. These threads remind us that the past is rarely as simple as our stereotypes. The Druids weren't a brotherhood, they were a tapestry woven with voices of both oak and willow, each strand vital to the pattern. The battlefield was more than a clash of steel, it was a theater of the mind, and the Druids were its master playwrights. Strabo's chilling account describes Celtic warriors charging into combat alongside naked, blue-painted Druids, their bodies twisted in grotesque contortions as they screamed curses toward the enemy lines. This wasn't mere spectacle, it was psychological warfare distilled to its essence. Imagine facing an army where the fighters weren't just armed with swords, but with the terrifying aura of otherworldly allies. The Romans, disciplined as they were, wrote of the unnerving effect these rituals had on their troops, how the air itself seemed to thicken with dread when the Druids raised their voices in unison, invoking forces no shield could block. But the real weapon wasn't the nakedness or the war paint, it was the power of belief. The Celts saw battle as a sacred drama, where the outcome hinged as much on supernatural favor as on strength. Before a single spear was thrown, Druids performed the Tarb phase, or bull divination, a ritual where a chosen seer would feast on the flesh of a sacrificial bull, then wrap himself in its hide to sleep. His dreams would reveal the battle's fate, interpreted through symbols only the initiated could decode. A vision of eagles might signal victory, while crows could warn of impending slaughter. These prophecies weren't just passive omens, they shaped strategy. A negative reading might delay an attack for days, demoralizing enemies who'd prepared for immediate combat, or emboldening Celtic warriors who trusted their seers over their eyes. Then there was the glam disin, the satirical curse. In a culture where reputation was currency, a Druid's poetic scorn could be deadlier than any blade. Irish texts describe bards whose verses could literally raise boils on a king's face if he broke an oath, or whose ridicule could turn allies against a once respected leader. On the battlefield, these curses weren't mere insults, they were existential threats. A well-aimed glam disin might accuse an enemy chieftain of cowardice, undermining his authority mid-battle, or declare his lineage false, eroding the loyalty of his warriors. The power lay in collective belief. If enough people accepted the curse as truth, it became reality. The genius of these tactics was their duality. The naked Druids unnerved foes with their otherness, the Tarb phase gave strategic advantage through divination, and the glam disin weaponized social order itself. Together, they created a feedback loop of terror and faith where every Roman soldier who hesitated at the sight of a screaming Druid reinforced the Celts' belief in their own invincibility. Modern militaries still employ psychological ops, from playing deafening music to demoralize besieged enemies to spreading disinformation. The Druids were pioneers of this art, understanding that war is won not just in the body, but in the space between perception and fear. Their rituals remind us that the most potent weapons are often the ones we can't hold, only feel. The year was 60 AD when the shores of Anglesey turned crimson under Roman boots. Tacitus, never one to spare grim details, recounts the scene in his annals: a shoreline packed with Druids, their arms raised to the sky, hurling curses as the invaders waded through the shallows. Behind them, women cloaked in black like furies, their torches casting ghastly shadows as they set their own sacred groves ablaze rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The Roman soldiers, hardened by campaigns across the empire, hesitated not at the threat of blades, but at the sheer otherness of this defiance. Then the order came. By dusk, the island's oaks were splintered, its altars shattered, and the Druids' last stronghold became a testament to Rome's ruthless efficiency. But Anglesey wasn't the beginning of the end, it was the climax of a decades-long campaign. A century earlier, Augustus himself had outlawed Druidism, banning Roman citizens from participating in their rites. The reasoning was as political as it was cultural. The Druids weren't just priests, they were the glue binding Celtic tribes together, their influence crossing borders no Roman governor could easily control. Julius Caesar had laid the groundwork, claiming in his Gallic wars that human sacrifice justified intervention, yet archaeology tells a subtler story. In Gaul, sanctuaries like Ribemont-sur-Ancre show signs of systematic dismantling, altars broken, sacred wells filled with rubble, and in some cases entire groves felled and burned. The message was clear: Rome wouldn't just conquer the land, it would erase its soul. The suppression followed a chillingly modern playbook. First, the infrastructure of knowledge was targeted. Sacred groves, living libraries where teachings passed between generations, were reduced to charcoal. Next, the social hierarchy. Druids lost their legal authority, their roles as judges and mediators stripped by Roman magistrates. Finally, the cultural erasure. Celtic elites were co-opted, their sons sent to Roman schools to learn Latin rhetoric instead of bardic verse. Temples to Jupiter and Minerva rose where oak circles once stood, their stone columns a stark contrast to the organic sanctity of the groves. Yet traces of resistance linger in the dirt. At the sanctuary of Gournay-sur-Arronde in France, excavators found weapons ritually bent and buried, a Celtic tradition of killing objects to release their spirits hidden beneath Roman-era buildings. In Britain, lead-cursed tablets inscribed in Latin implore local deities like Sulis, a fusion of Celtic Sol and Roman Minerva, to strike down thieves, proving old beliefs didn't die, they went underground. Even in Rome's heart, the backlash spoke volumes. Pliny the Elder complained of Celtic herbs and charms circulating among Rome's elite, their potency feared and coveted. The empire could cut down the trees, but the roots ran too deep to fully destroy. The greatest irony, Rome's own accounts preserved what they sought to erase. By documenting Druidic practices to condemn them, writers like Tacitus and Pliny ensured their survival. Anglesey's massacre became legend not because it ended the old ways, but because it revealed their resilience. The Druids faded from history not with a whimper, but with curses on their lips, and those curses, like the mistletoe in the oak's crown, refused to let go. When the last sacred groves fell to Rome's axes, Ireland became the unexpected ark for Druidic wisdom. Cut off from continental Europe's conquests, this island of mist and myth offered sanctuary where the old ways could survive, not through defiance but through transformation. Enter the Fili, the poetic inheritors of the Druids' mantle. These keepers of verse traded white robes for monks' tonsures, their rhymes dripping with double meanings that paid lip service to the new Christian order while preserving the bones of the past. Take the Colloquy of the Two Sages, a medieval text where two Fili engage in a verbal duel so dense with layered metaphor it feels like decoding a cipher. Their exchanges are studded with references to oak knowledge and otherworld visions, Druidic concepts disguised as poetic flair. Even the word fili itself is a clue, derived from the Old Irish fili meaning seer. It echoes the prophetic role of their predecessors. These weren't just entertainers, they were memory keepers, their verses a Trojan horse for forbidden lore. Christian scribes unwittingly preserved this legacy. St. Columba's hagiography recounts his showdowns with magi, a label slapped onto Druidic holdouts who challenged his miracles with their own demonic arts. One story tells of a magus named Broichan who summoned storms to halt Columba's boat, only for the saint to still the winds with a prayer. The subtext: a power struggle between old and new magic, where the Druids' control over nature was recast as diabolical. Yet Columba's own origins betray the overlap. Born into the Uí dynasty, he came from a family steeped in the very traditions he supposedly vanquished. The fili thrived in this liminal space. Monasteries became unlikely archives for their subversive verse. The lorica, or breastplate prayers attributed to saints like Patrick, brim with incantations to bind enemies, a phrasing suspiciously close to older Druidic curses. Even the famous Book of Kells hides pagan echoes in its intricate knotwork, designs mirroring the triskells and spirals found on pre-Christian altars. What emerged was a shadow tradition. The fili's highest rank, the ollum, required 12 years of training, just like the Druids' curriculum. They memorized hundreds of genealogies, not merely to flatter kings but to preserve tribal land claims that predated church authority. Their satires could still raise boils or at least ruin reputations, proving the old glam Disin hadn't lost its teeth. The most telling survival lies in place. Holy wells, once sacred to Brigid, the triple goddess of healing, were rededicated to Saint Brigid, their waters still sought for cures. The festival of Imbolc, marking the lactation of ewes, became Candlemas, same timing, new saints. The fili didn't just adapt, they wove Christianity into the Celtic cosmos so seamlessly that even priests couldn't untangle the threads. By the time the Normans invaded in the 12th century, the fili were fading, their roles supplanted by written law and church-sanctioned historians. But their greatest trick was making the past indelible. Open any medieval Irish text and you'll find Druids lurking in the margins, not as villains but as wise advisors, their prophecies driving plots. The fili knew what Rome never grasped. You can't erase a tradition that lives in the breath between words, in the spaces where memory masquerades as myth. The wild man in the woods muttering prophecies to the ravens. This haunting figure lurks at the crossroads of myth and history, where the last whispers of the Druids shape one of literature's most enduring wizards. The Merlin we know, Arthur's advisor, the enchanter of Camelot, is actually a tapestry woven from threads older than legend itself. Welsh lore speaks of Myrddin Wyllt, a mad prophet who fled battle to live among wolves, his ramblings laced with uncanny foresight. Irish tales tell of Suib and Jaelt, a king cursed with flight and poetry after witnessing the horrors of war. Both figures, dripping with Druidic echoes, would merge centuries later in the crucible of Arthurian romance, birthing a sorcerer who was neither fully Christian nor pagan, but something far more intriguing, a bridge between worlds. Myrddin's origins are steeped in the old ways. In the Black Book of Carmarthen, he's no courtly magician but a ragged seer, howling verses to the wind like the fili of Ireland. His madness, triggered by the carnage of Afterid, mirrors the digital Ducheneb, the prophetic trances of Druids who chewed on raw flesh to induce visions. Even his name hints at deeper roots. Myrddin may derive from Morjunan, an ancient Celtic term meaning sea fort, linking him to sacred sites like Merlin's Hill in Wales, where folklore claims he still sleeps in a crystal cave. The ravens that accompany him aren't just Gothic flair. They're survivors of the Druidic belief that corvids carried messages between realms. Then there's Suibon, the Irish king who sprouted feathers and fled into the treetops after a Christian saint cursed him. His Bill Suaben, the frenzy of Suaben, reads like a druidic lament. He perches in yew trees, eats only watercress, and composes piercing verses about nature's cruelty. His condition, jailed or wildness, mirrors the wilt madness of Mirden, both states granting supernatural insight, much like the druidic practice of seeking wisdom through sensory deprivation in forests. Even Suaben's death, pierced by a spear while reciting poetry, echoes the sacrificial fate of figures like the bog bodies, their deaths a gateway to prophecy. When Geoffrey of Montham fused these figures into Merlin for his History of the Kings of Britain, he didn't invent a character, he bottled lightning. His Merlin is a paradox, a Christian-era prophet with one foot in the pagan past, advising kings while retreating to the wilderness like Mirden. He drafts Arthur's laws like a druidic judge, yet his magic owes more to medieval grimoires than mistletoe rites. This duality wasn't accidental. Geoffrey, a Welsh Norman cleric, walked the same tightrope as the filly, preserving Celtic motifs under a veneer of church approval. His Merlin doesn't chant under oaks, but his prophecies drip with the same ominous ambiguity as the Ceolbran Y Baird, the druidic alphabet of the Bards said to reveal fate. The Arthurian romancers who followed sharpened the blend. French tales polished Merlin into a courtly advisor, but his wilderness episodes, like vanishing into the forest with Nimue, betray his wildman roots. Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur even pits Merlin against the Christian maiden Blaise, their tension mirroring the real-world clash between druidic holdouts and missionaries. By the Renaissance, Merlin had become a literary Rorschach test. Humanists saw a proto-scientist, occultists a master of hermetic arts, and romantics a symbol of nature's untamed wisdom. Yet the deepest magic lies in what wasn't erased. When Vivienne traps Merlin in a tree or a cave, depending on the version, it's more than a fairy tale, it's a metaphor for how druidic knowledge survived. Like the filly hiding lore in saintly hymns, Merlin's imprisonment preserves him. The tree, sacred to the Celts, becomes his ark. Even his famed prophecy of the red and white dragons draws from Welsh triads older than Geoffrey's ink. The genius of Merlin isn't his power but his permeability, a vessel for whispers the church couldn't silence, proof that some roots run too deep to ever truly die. The late 18th century was a time of revolutions not just in America and France but in the imagination. As industrial smoke began to choke the skies over Britain, a curious thing happened. The Druids, long vanished from history, came roaring back to life. Not in the forests, but in the pages of poets and the ceremonies of eccentric visionaries. At the center of this revival stood Iarlaid Morgannwg, a Welsh stonemason with a flair for the dramatic and a dangerous talent for invention. His creation, the Gorsedd of the Bards, would become the foundation for modern Druidry, despite being stitched together from equal parts medieval poetry, Masonic ritual, and outright fabrication. Iarlaid's genius lay in his timing. The Romantic movement had Europe in its thrall, hungry for ancient mysticism as an antidote to the cold logic of the Enlightenment. When he unveiled his Gorsedd ceremonies on Primrose Hill in 1792, complete with white robes, flower garlands, and a Druid's prayer, he claimed to have translated from ancient Welsh. Audiences were enchanted. There was just one problem. Nearly everything was made up, the prayer penned by Iarlaid himself, the rituals borrowed from Freemasonry and spiced with Welsh folklore. Even the iconic Orn symbol, 3 rays of light representing inspiration, was his own design, though he insisted it dated back to the Iron Age. Yet Iarlaid's fabrications took root because they fed a deeper yearning. His vision of Druids as peaceful nature priests, guardians of lost Welsh identity, resonated in an era when Wales itself was fighting cultural extinction under English rule. The Gorsedd staged ceremonies, with their pseudo-medieval language and reverence for the Welsh language, became political theatre, subtly rebelling against the empire that had erased the real Druids centuries earlier. By the time scholars exposed Iollow's forgeries, it hardly mattered. His invented traditions had already woven themselves into the DNA of Welsh nationalism. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Stonehenge was undergoing its own mythical makeover. Antiquarian William Stukeley, surveying the ruins in the 1740s, became convinced the site was a Druidic temple despite the inconvenient fact it predated the Celts by millennia. His sketches of white-robed Druids processing among the stones, published in Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids, captured the public imagination. Never mind that the Druids' alleged connection to Stonehenge relied on a single ambiguous line from the Roman historian Dio Cassius, written centuries after the stones were erected. Stukeley's romanticized imagery stuck, transforming a Neolithic burial site into the ultimate backdrop for neo-Druidic pageantry. The legacy of this creative reinvention is still alive today. When modern Druid groups gather at Stonehenge for the solstice, their ceremonies complete with Iollos, Orn, symbol and invocations of the spirit of the land, are less a revival of antiquity than a continuation of the 18th century's romantic dreams. Even the division between religious and cultural Druidry traces back to this era, with groups like the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids blending Iollo's theatricality with earnest spiritual seeking. What's fascinating isn't the deception, but the need that fueled it. The Druid revival wasn't about fakery, it was about filling a void. In a world upended by factories and empires, Iollo and his peers offered a lost golden age, a touchstone for identity and belonging. Their imagined Druids, noble and wise, became mirrors for contemporary anxieties, just as the historical Druids had once been caricatured by their Roman conquerors. The circle, it seems, remains unbroken. We've always remade the past to serve the present, and perhaps that's the most Druidic tradition of all. The discovery of the Coligny calendar in 1897 sent shockwaves through the academic world, but recent advancements in archaeology have unlocked even more of its secrets. High-resolution scans reveal microscopic tool marks showing how the bronze fragments were meticulously corrected over generations, like a celestial spreadsheet updated for cosmic drift. The real breakthrough came when researchers cross-referenced its lunar cycles with eclipse records, proving its predictions were accurate to within hours centuries before the Gregorian calendar achieved similar precision. This wasn't primitive stargazing, it was a mathematical masterpiece, one that likely required collaborative observations across Celtic Europe to refine. Then there's the DNA revolution rewriting the story of Druidic sacrifice. Take Toland Man, the famously preserved bog body from Denmark. Earlier theories assumed he was a criminal or outcast, but isotopic analysis of his teeth tells a different tale. The last meal in his stomach, a ritual porridge of barley, flax, and wild herbs, matches descriptions of sacred gruel from Irish texts, consumed before crossing to the other world. Even more revealing, his hair contained traces of mistletoe pollen, echoing Pliny's account of Druidic harvest rites. Suddenly, this 2,000-year-old corpse becomes a potential window into ceremonies where plant lore and prophecy intertwined. Modern forensics have also appended assumptions about violence. CT scans of Lindoman's skull show his head injuries were inflicted with surgical precision, not the frenzied blows of battle, but calculated strikes matching the threefold death motif in Celtic myth. Oxygen isotopes in his bones suggest he traveled from the Scottish Highlands to his final resting place in Cheshire, possibly as a chosen envoy between tribes. These findings dismantle the Roman narrative of mindless brutality, revealing instead a cosmology where sacrifice was transactional, a solemn bargain with forces beyond human control. The most unexpected insights come from pollen. Core samples taken near Anglesea's sacred springs contain abnormal levels of hallucinogenic plants henbane, deadly nightshade dating to the Druidic era. Combined with residues on ritual cups, it suggests controlled use of psychoactives for visions, much like the Imbaz Forestnigh Enlightenment rituals in Irish lore. But here's the twist. Chemical analysis shows these mixtures were carefully balanced with antidotes like yarrow to mitigate toxicity. This wasn't reckless shamanism, it was a nuanced pharmacology where altering consciousness walked hand in hand with preserving life. Perhaps the most poignant discovery emerged from a nondescript field in Essex. A 2018 geophysical survey uncovered a vast circular ditch, its alignment matching the Coligny calendar's solstice markers. Unlike Stonehenge, this site, dubbed Seahenge for its coastal location, was built after the Roman invasion, its oak posts felled in 60 AD. The message is clear: even under occupation, the old knowledge persisted, adapting in ways that left no trace in conquerors' records. The Druids may have vanished from history, but their legacy lingers in the soil, waiting for our tools to tease it free. Carved into the weathered edges of standing stones across Ireland and Wales, the Ogham script rises like silent sentinels of a lost language. These cryptic lines, straight slashes branching off a central stem, seem simple at first glance, but their secrets run as deep as the roots of the trees they honor. Each character corresponds to a letter, yes, but also to a specific tree or plant, weaving language and nature into an inseparable whole. Take the first letter, Beith birch, symbolizing new beginnings and purification, its slender strokes mirroring the tree's delicate bark. To write a name in Ogham wasn't just to spell it, it was to invoke the very essence of the natural world, binding identity to the land in a way that felt almost like magic. Theories about Ogham's origins are as tangled as ivy. Some scholars argue it was created as a cipher, a way for Druids to encode messages under Roman noses. Others see it as a ritual script, its vertical lines mimicking the upright stance of Druids during invocations, each stroke a frozen gesture of prayer. The most compelling clue lies in its structure. The four groups of letters are called Aechmi, meaning tribe or family, suggesting the alphabet itself was a living thing, organized like a kinship network. And then there's the sound of it. Spoken Ogham isn't just recited, it's performed, with each letter's name evoking the rustle of leaves or the crack of a branch, turning speech into an incantation. But Ogham's true power may have been its invisibility. Unlike Roman inscriptions meant to be seen, many Ogham stones are carved along the edges, their messages hidden unless you know to run your fingers along the stone's ridge. This wasn't just practicality, it was sacrament. To read Ogham required touch, intimacy, a communion between reader and stone that mirrored the Druidic bond with the earth. Some stones even bear blind Ogham, grooves with no discernible meaning, perhaps meant to be traced in darkness as part of initiation rites, where knowledge came not through sight but through the body's memory. Christianity's arrival didn't erase Ogham, it repurposed it. Early monks, keen to convert pagan sites into Christian ones, often left the stones standing but added their own twists. The Kilmalcadar stone in Ireland, for example, pairs Ogham with a Latin cross, a visual truce between old and new faiths. Others, like the Tullicommon stone, bear bilingual inscriptions, the Ogham declaring a Celtic name while the Latin script dedicates the stone to a saint. This wasn't suppression, it was syncretism, a way to graft the new onto the old without severing the roots. The most haunting Ogham inscriptions are those that defy translation. The stone at Ratas Church in Kerry reads simply Maki Mukoi, son of the tribe. No name, no lineage, just a whisper of belonging. Was it a grave marker? A territorial claim, or something more elusive, like a threshold prayer for travelers passing between worlds? The stones won't say. But their very silence speaks volumes about a culture where words weren't just written. They were grown, harvested, and offered back to the earth like sacred fruit. What endures is the poetry of it all. Modern attempts to revive Ogham as a divination tool, drawing tree letters for guidance, may lack historical basis, but they capture the spirit of a script that was never just practical. It was a bridge between worlds where a stroke in stone could summon the strength of an oak or the resilience of a yew. Even now, running a hand along an ogham stone feels less like reading and more like listening. To the wind in the branches, to the Druids' lost voices, to the slow, patient language of the earth itself. Hollywood has a habit of turning the Druids into either wizened old men clutching staffs or shrieking fanatics in tattered robes, caricatures more at home in a fantasy novel than the pages of history. Think Christopher Lee's chilling performance in The Wicker Man, where Druids are reduced to pagan boogeymen, their rituals twisted into something grotesque and malevolent. It's a gripping story, but it owes more to Gothic horror than to actual Celtic traditions. The truth is, filmmakers often use the Druids as shorthand for ancient and mysterious, stripping away their complexity in favor of atmosphere. Even movies that aim for authenticity, like The Eagle, can't resist the urge to dress them in animal skulls and mud, as if they were perpetually mid-ritual. But not every portrayal misses the mark. Video games, of all places, have begun digging deeper into the nuances of Druidic culture. Assassin's Creed Valhalla introduces players to a Druid named Derda, a healer and scholar who navigates the clash between Norse invaders and Celtic traditions with surprising subtlety. Her character isn't just a plot device, she's a mediator, versed in herb lore and tribal politics, reflecting the historical role of Druids as advisors and keepers of balance. The game's Wrath of the Druids expansion goes further, showcasing sacred groves where rituals feel less like spectacle and more like lived tradition, complete with solstice alignments and ogham-inscribed stones. It's a far cry from the usual Hollywood fire and brimstone. The difference lies in the research. Where films often rely on Roman propaganda for their imagery, games like Valhalla draw from archaeological finds, the Coligny calendar's timekeeping, the reverence for oak and mistletoe, even the strategic use of satire as a social weapon. Even fantasy titles like The Witcher 3 get closer to the spirit of the Druids than most historical dramas, portraying them as ecologists and philosophers who wield influence through knowledge rather than brute force. Geralt's encounters with the Dryads of Broccolin Forest, for instance, echo the Celtic belief in nature as a sentient force, something to be negotiated with, not conquered. What's fascinating is how these pop culture interpretations reflect our own changing relationship with the past. The Druids of horror films embody our fear of the unknown, the primitive, lurking just beyond the light of civilization. But the more nuanced portrayals, whether in games, novels, or even graphic novels like Slain, suggest a growing curiosity about indigenous wisdom, about systems of knowledge that didn't rely on conquest or written dogma. Perhaps that's why modern audiences are drawn to these quieter, more thoughtful depictions. They offer a glimpse of a world where power wasn't just about domination but about harmony. The next time you see a Druid on screen, ask yourself, is this a warning or an invitation? Are they showing us monsters or mirrors? Because the way we imagine the Druids says less about them and more about what we've lost and what we might still rediscover. Neo-Druidism today is less a single tradition than a tapestry of revival movements, each weaving threads of ancient inspiration with modern spirituality. At the heart of this resurgence lies the Bonewit scale, a clever framework devised by Druid scholar Isaac Bonewits to measure how closely modern practices align with historical evidence. On one end, you have Reconstructionist groups painstakingly piecing together rituals from archaeology and medieval texts. On the other, eclectic circles blending Celtic motifs with mindfulness and environmental activism. The scale isn't about gatekeeping, it's about transparency, helping seekers understand whether they're engaging with something rooted in Iron Age fragments or a creative reimagining for contemporary life. Take the order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, or Abad, one of the largest neo-Druidic organizations. Their approach leans into what they call the mystery school tradition, less about replicating the past and more about personal transformation through nature connection, storytelling, and meditation. Walk into one of their gatherings and you might see members in flowing robes reciting poetry under oak trees, but you'll also find therapists, scientists, and teachers drawn to the ecological wisdom embedded in Druidic symbolism. Their rituals often incorporate modern psychology, like visualizing the four elements as aspects of inner balance, while still honoring the seasonal cycles that anchored Celtic spirituality. This fusion sparks heated debates, particularly around cultural appropriation. When non-Celtic practitioners adopt Ogham script as a personal talisman or use the triskel in mass-produced jewelry, does it honor the tradition or dilute it? Some indigenous Celtic activists argue these symbols carry ancestral weight. The triskel, for instance, appears on pre-Christian artifacts like Newgrange's curbstones as a sacred representation of life's interconnectedness. Others, including many within Abad, see sharing these symbols as a form of cultural exchange, so long as it's done with respect and a commitment to understanding their origins. The line between appreciation and appropriation often hinges on context. Are these symbols being commodified, or are they gateways to deeper learning? Eco-spirituality has become Neo-Druidism's most visible legacy. Modern groups champion reforestation, watershed protection, and sustainable living as acts of devotion, framing climate activism as a spiritual imperative. This isn't just tree-hugging with a Celtic aesthetic, it's a deliberate echo of the Druids' role as intermediaries between humans and the natural world. The difference: today's rituals might include lobbying for environmental policies or hosting biodegradable seed paper Ogham workshops. The reverence remains, but the methods adapt. Yet beneath the surface, there's a tension between innovation and authenticity. Some criticize Druid light practices watered-down versions that prioritize aesthetic over substance, like wearing a cloak for Instagram but skipping the years of study a historical Druid would have endured. Others counter that spirituality must evolve to stay relevant, pointing to the Celts' own knack for absorbing and adapting outside influences. After all, if the original Druids were the intellectual elite of their time, wouldn't their modern counterparts need to engage with today's crises, from biodiversity loss to digital alienation, with equal creativity? What unites these diverse approaches is a shared longing to reconnect with a worldview where humanity isn't separate from nature but woven into it. Whether through reconstructed fire ceremonies or forest therapy sessions, Neo-Druids are grappling with the same questions their ancestors might have recognized: how to live in right relationship with the earth, how to find meaning in life cycles, and how to keep wisdom alive when the old groves are gone. The answers vary, but the search itself is perhaps the most Druidic practice of all. The pages of medieval Irish manuscripts glow with intricate illuminations, saints in vibrant blues and golds, their halos gleaming. But hidden between these holy images lurk shadows of a much older world. The Liber Gabala Iren, or Book of Invasions, is perhaps the most striking example, a supposedly Christian chronicle of Ireland's mythical settlers that reads like a palimpsest of pagan memory. On the surface, it's a biblical parallel, waves of invaders mirroring the Old Testament's genealogies, culminating in the arrival of the pious Gaels. But scratch that surface and the Druidic past bleeds through. The text describes the Tuatha De Danann, a godlike race with unmistakable parallels to Celtic deities, their mastery of magic and prophecy echoing the skills of the Druids themselves. These weren't just colorful characters, they were deities in disguise, their stories carefully reshaped to fit a Christian framework while preserving their essence. Monastic scribes were masters of this literary alchemy. Take the Dinsentures, a collection of poems explaining place names across Ireland. A hill might be renamed for a saint, but the verse beneath tells of a warrior's blood soaking the soil or a goddess turned to stone, pagan myths repackaged as folklore. Even the famed Cath Mage Tuatha, a saga of epic battles between the Tuatha De Danann and their foes, was preserved not for its thrilling combat but as a cautionary tale. The pagan gods, though powerful, were ultimately flawed, their world giving way to a new order. The brilliance of these scribes lay in their subtlety. They didn't erase the old beliefs, they hollowed them out, filling them with Christian meaning like bees repurposing abandoned hives. But how do we separate the pagan fragments from the monastic overlay? The clues often lie in incongruities. When St. Patrick's hagiographies describe him debating the Druids, the adversary's arguments are suspiciously eloquent, almost as if the scribes were recording genuine Druidic philosophies even as they framed them as heresy. The triads of Ireland, pithy sayings grouped in threes, retain a distinctly pre-Christian flavor. Three things that never satisfy: a fool, a fire, a flood. Their terse wisdom mirrors older Celtic legal triads, suggesting they were oral traditions transcribed with minimal edits. Even the Carmina Gaedlica, a collection of Scottish prayers gathered in the 1800s, contains charms for blessing cattle or warding off evil that scholars trace to pre-Christian incantations, their pagan heart still beating beneath layers of Christian language. The most revealing distortions appear in the treatment of sacred sites. Wells once dedicated to the goddess Brigid became St. Brigid's holy springs, their waters still sought for healing. The festival of Imbolc, marking the lambing season, was rebranded as Candlemas same date, new saint. This wasn't mere coincidence, it was strategic. By grafting Christian observances onto pagan rhythms, the Church ensured continuity of practice while redirecting devotion. The peasants who left offerings at a well didn't need to know whether they were honoring a saint or a goddess. The ritual itself endured, yet some texts resisted full conversion. The wooing of Atene reads like a pagan dreamscape, its characters' shape shifting, dying, and rebirthing in cycles that defy Christian linearity. The scribes who copied it likely didn't understand its deeper cosmological themes: the Celtic belief in reincarnation, the fluid boundaries between human and divine. They preserved it like a fossil, intact but disconnected from its original meaning. Similarly, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, Ireland's epic cattle raid, brims with Druidic symbolism. Prophetic dreams, Gisa that bind heroes to fate, battles timed by celestial signs despite being penned by monks centuries after Christianity's triumph. The irony is profound. The very institutions that sought to suppress the old ways became their unwitting archivists. By recording pagan tales as curiosities or morality plays, monastic scribes saved them from oblivion. Today, scholars pore over these texts like detectives, sifting for echoes of the Druid's voice, a half-remembered chant, a fragment of star lore, a place name that whispers of sacred groves long gone. What emerges isn't a clean divide between pagan and Christian, but a dialogue, one where the past refuses to be silenced, even as it wears the robes of the present. Stretching across continents and centuries, the threads of sacred knowledge intertwine in ways that defy simple borders. The Druids were not alone in their role as mediators between the human and divine. Half a world away, the Vedic Brahmins of ancient India mirrored their vocation with uncanny precision. Both groups guarded oral traditions so sacred that writing was considered inadequate, even dangerous. The Brahmins' Shruti, text hymns heard directly from the cosmos, were passed mouth to ear for generations, just as Druidic lore was whispered under oak boughs. Their rituals, too, orbited around sacrifice, though with a key distinction. Where Druids might offer mistletoe or, in extreme cases, a life to restore cosmic balance, the Brahmins performed yajna, fire ceremonies where clarified butter and herbs became conduits to the gods. Both cultures saw the act as transactional, a sacred exchange to maintain RTA cosmic order in India, or don the gift of fate in Celtic lands. Venture north to the frostbitten realms of the Norse, and another parallel emerges in the Godi, the ritual leaders of Viking society. Like the Druids, they were both priests and politicians, overseeing blot sacrifices where blood was splashed on idols and participants, to secure favor from Odin or Thor. The Godi's role as law speaker at the Thing assembly, echoes the Druidic arbitration of tribal disputes under sacred trees. Yet the Norse lacked the Druids' formalized education. Their power stemmed more from personal charisma and kinship ties than decades of memorized verse. Where a Druid's authority flowed from cosmic knowledge, a Godes often rested on the edge of a sword. Then there are the Siberian shamans, whose practices overlapped with the Druids' most mystical aspects. Both entered trances to traverse worlds, the shamans riding drumbeats to the lower world, while Druids chewed raw flesh or fasted to induce imbasphorosnai, the illumination of inspiration. Each served as healers, interpreting illness as soul loss or cosmic imbalance, but the shamans operated on society's fringes, often as lone wanderers, while Druids were enmeshed in the elite, advising kings and shaping laws. What binds these traditions is their shared understanding of speech as magic. The Brahmins' mantras, the Godes' Galder chants, the shamans' spirit songs, all resonate with the Druidic belief that words could bend reality. A Norse skald's curse could wither crops as surely as a Druid's glam dissin, and a Brahmin's mispronounced hymn might invite disaster. These weren't just rituals, they were technologies of the sacred refined across millennia. The differences, though, reveal just as much. The Brahmin's rigid caste system had no equivalent in Celtic society, where a gifted child from any clan might train as a Druid. Norse religion was more democratic. Any free man could offer to the gods, but lacked the Druids' intellectual rigor. And where Siberian shamans often bore the scars of spiritual crisis, marked by their communities as wounded healers, Druids were polished scholars, their authority etched in years of study rather than ecstatic suffering. Perhaps the most poignant contrast lies in their fates. Brahmanism endured, adapting to become Hinduism's backbone. The Godi faded with Viking conversion. Siberian shamanism was nearly crushed by Soviet persecution. The Druids, they dissolved into the landscape, their practices surviving as whispers in folklore, their influence seeping into medieval bards and modern environmental movements. These connections remind us that the sacred is never solitary. It's a conversation echoing across time and terrain, waiting for those who still know how to listen. Pliny the Elder's natural history teases us with one of antiquity's most cryptic artifacts, the ovum anguinum, or Druid's egg. Described as a translucent orb formed from the intertwined saliva of serpents, it was said to grant victory in legal disputes and deflect curses when carried into battle. Roman scholars dismissed it as superstition, but modern herpetologists offer a tantalizing alternative. Could this egg have been a fossilized sea urchin, its radial patterns resembling coiled snakes? These fossils, common in Celtic regions, were prized as amulets across ancient Europe. Yet no archaeological dig has ever unearthed a confirmed ovum anguinum, leaving us to wonder, was Pliny recording a genuine ritual object or merely recycling travelers' tall tales? The mystery deepens when we consider similar artifacts in other traditions. The Glain Nadrid of Welsh folklore, a snake stone with healing properties, mirrors the description eerily. Were these objects part of a wider pan-Celtic tradition, their true purpose lost when the Druids' oral teachings faded? Then there's the question of altered states. The Greek historian Strabo claimed Druid seers inhaled vapors to induce visions, while Irish myths speak of the Tarb phase, a bull feast ritual where aspirants wrapped themselves in hides to dream of future kings. Recent pollen analysis from Anglesea's sacred springs adds fuel to the fire. Traces of henbane, a potent hallucinogen, alongside yarrow, which counteracts its toxicity. This precise combination suggests pharmacological sophistication, not mere accident. Were Druids the original psychonauts, using controlled doses to navigate the other world? Compare this to the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, where initiates drank kykeon, a brew now theorized to contain ergot fungus. Both cultures may have viewed mind-altering substances as tools, not indulgences, keys to unlocking realms where gods and ancestors whispered. But perhaps the most staggering enigma lies in their celestial precision. The Coligny calendar's lunar calculations are impressive enough, but stone alignments like those at Callanish in Scotland hint at even deeper astronomical knowledge. One slab points perfectly to the southernmost moonrise during its 18.6-year cycle, a phenomenon only observable through generations of meticulous record-keeping. How did they achieve this without telescopes or written records? Babylonian astronomers left clay tablets detailing their methods, but the Druids' techniques died with them. Some scholars speculate they used horizon markers, natural peaks, or standing stones to track celestial movements over decades, embedding this knowledge in star lore poems passed between initiates. The alignment of Newgrange's Passage tomb with the winter solstice sunrise, built 3,000 years before the Druids, raises another possibility. Did they inherit and refine a megalithic tradition already ancient in their time? These gaps in understanding aren't just academic, they're invitations. Every unanswered question whispers of a world where science and spirituality weren't opposing forces but facets of the same crystal. The Druids' egg might symbolize cosmic unity, their hallucinogens a bridge between measurable and mystical, their astronomy a dialogue with the heavens. What survives isn't just fragments of history but a challenge to rethink how we categorize knowledge itself. After all, isn't the greatest mystery not what they knew but how they knew it? The Druids were meant to vanish, that was Rome's intention. Shatter their groves, silence their voices, and rewrite history in the empire's favor. Yet something remarkable happened. Their wisdom didn't disappear, it seeped into the bedrock of Europe's intellectual tradition, shaping the world in ways few textbooks acknowledge. Consider the monasteries that preserved classical knowledge during the Dark Ages. Many stood on land once sacred to Druids, their scribes unconsciously echoing the oral precision of bards as they copied manuscripts. The Carolingian Renaissance, that flash of enlightenment under Charlemagne, drew on Irish monastic scholarship, the very learning nurtured by the Fili, who'd smuggled Druidic thought into Christian cloisters. Even the concept of academic debate traces back to Celtic assemblies where Druids arbitrated truth through structured discourse, not force. What's truly staggering is how their legacy thrived in plain sight. The Triskel, that triple spiral carved into Neolithic stones, resurfaced in Christian trinities. The reverence for sacred wells persisted as pilgrims sought cures at saint shrines. And the solstice alignments of megalithic sites, they still draw crowds today, though most celebrants don't realize they're walking in footsteps laid down millennia before Rome's legions marched. This isn't just survival, it's metamorphosis. The Druids' greatest lesson was adaptability, teaching us that ideas can outlast empires when they're woven into the fabric of place and practice. To understand their impact, you have to step outside the pages of history and into the landscapes they hallowed. Stand at the hill of Tara at dawn, where the Lear fail. The legendary stone of destiny still pulses with the echoes of kings crowned under Druidic rites. Walk the Carnac alignments in Brittany, where 3,000 standing stones stretch like a petrified army, their purpose whispered only to the wind. These places aren't relics, they're proof that the past is never truly past. The Romans wrote the Druids out of their records, but the land remembers. The oak remembers, so here's the challenge: question the tidy narratives. When you read that Rome, civilized barbarian Europe, ask whose voices are missing from that story. When you hear Druids reduced to primitive shamans, remember the Coligny calendar's celestial math or the Brehon law's sophisticated justice. Their legacy isn't locked in books, it's encoded in the way we still seek balance with nature, in the power we give to poetry, in the quiet understanding that some truths are too vast to be written down. The Druids didn't just shape history, they became it quietly, stubbornly, leaf by leaf and stone by stone, and their story isn't finished yet.